To begin, I want to congratulate the University of Minnesota Duluth men's hockey team who made it to the finals of the NCAA Division I championship. To make things doubly sweet, they beat Harvard. I watched part of the game, and it's really a great credit to them, program they developed, and I'll be rooting for them tomorrow night when they play Denver. We're now approaching the recess for the legislative session. I want to commend the legislature for what they've accomplished so far, getting the bills passed through the floors and to conference committee. Now when they come back, the real work begins. First of all, they need to reconcile their budget bills and work out their differences, the House and the Senate, and they need to establish a budget, meaning that the tax bill and the spending bills need to add up to a balanced budget. As Commissioner Franz has pointed out, we're $1.65 billion surplus after the reinsurance bill is now down to $1.5 billion surplus. Still plenty of room to achieve different objectives, but the legislature through the conference committees is going to have to go through what my administration went through for about 6 weeks before we submitted a budget, which is take all the ideas we have, all the things that we'd like to do, and decide which ones we're going to say yes to, which ones we're going to have to say no to in order to fit within an honest budget. And that's incumbent on the legislative committees to achieve, and if and when they have accomplished that, and we have an accurate budget calculation on their part, match up to the one that I submitted in January, then we'll have the basis for negotiating, particularly on the budget itself, the differences that exist between us. Regarding other matters in the bill, I've urged that policy matters be left out of the budget bills, which of course was not been heeded. It's happened before, so it's not surprising to me, but it complicates the budget bills enormously. I'm asked, well, am I going to sign bills that come to me? Well, that depends. It depends on what they choose to put into those bills. I'll be sending next week a cover letter, and we'll have letters from the commissioners updating what they've sent before, which is the items in their existing House or Senate bills that they and I find unacceptable. And if those are recognized and accommodated, then they can send me bills that I can sign, assuming we can agree on the budget part of it. If they're going to send me bills that eliminate funding for pre-K, or that cut or delay the buffer legislation, or that strip the powers of the Public Utilities Commission to go through the Enbridge routing process and hand that over to the legislators. If they're going to got Metro Transit, eliminate LGA funding from Minneapolis alone, and if they're going to cut state agencies without any specification of what they want the agencies to not do, as I've stressed throughout the process, that everything the agencies do has been prescribed for them to do in statute by previous legislatures. If this legislature wants, or those that are in the majority want agencies to have their budgets reduced, then they need to be explicit about what they want those agencies not to do. What services do they want them not to provide people in Minnesota? And that's going to be a requirement of mine before I talk about, in an era of a $1.5 billion surplus, cutting state agencies as though there's just no consequence for their doing so. So those are examples of the issues where, if they choose to be confrontational with me, then we'll have confrontation. If they choose to decide to try to work out at the beginning of the process some reasonable accommodation after they set a budget, after we have that part of it, we're talking about apples and apples, then I see good opportunity to achieve that, and if not, we'll have to just take it from there. 5 weeks remaining when they return. Yeah. Excuse me, an ample amount of time to get these matters resolved on a timely basis. So that would be my goal. The leaders, both branches, both parties profess their desire to do the same. So where there's a will, there's a way, and I hope we could find a way to conclude the session by the constitutional deadline in May and everybody go home. Not you, but glad to respond to questions.
Do you see the House or Senate as more confrontational, either in tone or in substance, in their budget bills?
Well, I think the House has more, the items I just mentioned, the buffer, the pre-K funding, sat me the other day on the routing for Enbridge, Metro Transit, both of them really short-changed that. So, I say the House sends up, but, Commissioner Franz has raised concerns about the lack of budget veracity that would apply to both bodies, and that's got to be corrected. And again, the conference committees have to, and I assume it'll be the responsibility of the respective leadership, but the conference committees, what they come out with has got to add up in honest, straightforward accounting to a balanced budget, and we'll see what they're able to do on that. Well, I can handle tone. People want results. That's what matters. Words are, people's choices, but what people want is an honest budget, a sound budget, a fiscally responsible budget. What I want is one that meets my major priorities, which I've expressed in my own budget and subsequently, and in terms of the tax bill, doesn't have outline consequences that would really be severe for in future biennia, not even the one after this next one, but down the road, the decade. I've asked Commissioner Bowerly to develop an analysis of what happened after the 1999-2000 tax cuts, and then what happened the next decade in terms of the state's fiscal integrity. And to look at over the next 10 years, if either of the bills, the House or Senate, were to be enacted, what that consequence would be in terms of lost revenues. You add all of that to the uncertainties of what the federal government is going to pass on to the states. I mean, it's just I'm not going to let the fiscal integrity that we've worked hard to reestablish for the state be jeopardized for short-term political gains.
To make these bills acceptable to you in light of the size of tax cuts that the House and the Senate are talking about, either one or the other or both?
Well, that's one factor, and that's again why they need to come up with a budget. I mean, the House bills more than the surplus. So right away, you have numbers that don't add up on either the House or Senate side. And again, with the conference committee resolving their differences, but before I can begin a conversation, I need them to put forward what I put forward in January, which is a budget that is balanced, that does add up, and uses the kind of accounting that even statute requires in terms of the comparisons with the base and the like. So once that's achieved, then we've got a starting point. Until that's achieved, we're really, they're just talking different languages.
What people say, Governor, is that their budget does work, that those numbers do add up if there's spending reductions, which you have been resistant.
Well, I dispute that they add up if you really count, as the commissioner could elaborate, even with the spending cuts. So again, that's where the conference committees need to resolve, first of all, what are their differences between the House and the Senate, and also come up with a set of bills, including the tax bill and the spending bills, that we agree add up to a balanced budget on their side. I've got one on my side, and then we'll see what the differences are and how we can resolve those.
Governor, on Real ID, the conferees are named, the meetings are scheduled, there's going to be a conference committee. When I asked Representative Dowd about his view on that after the press conference he gave where he demanded the Senate come his direction, they did not do that. I asked him about that, and he managed to sound both inflexible and conciliatory at the same time. He said that they want to concentrate on Real ID, but at the same time he said that they literally want to keep the status quo with regard to undocumented immigrants, and he threw that issue in your court. How do you interpret all that?
I think all the issues are in my court as far as the speaker's concerned. You know, Real ID is Real ID. The House, in its version of the bill, is the ones that introduced the driver's license for undocumented people into the equation. I mean, I've been very clear with the legislature that as it exists now, current statute and the prohibition of the DPS to engage in any rulemaking regarding driver's licenses without the express authority of the legislature, that we do not have the authority. I do not claim to have the authority to initiate changes in who's eligible for driver's licenses on my own accord, or neither does the Commissioner of Public Safety. So it's not necessary for the legislature to do anything to preserve what Speaker Dowd says he wants. You have to ask them why they chose to interject the undocumented licenses into the discussion on Real ID, but I didn't bring it up. They're the ones who got it started, and then the Senate responded accordingly. So, you know, that's where it stands.
Well, which of those 2 points of view do you sort of take him at his word at? Is he going to insist on the undocumented provisions, or is he really going to focus just on Real ID? How do
You have to ask him. I don't know. I don't know. I know the Senate, I know Senator Gazelka yesterday, I know the Senate's trying to take the driver's license, the undocumented part of it out of the Real ID legislation and have a clean bill and get it passed. And it's my understanding that as yet the House has not agreed to that. So, I mean, that's where it stands at this point as far as I know.
You say that the outright prohibition, as it were, in other words, putting it in state law, codifying it in state law is not necessary. If they were to send you a bill that does that, is that a bill you would not support, even though it just duplicates what? Well, why not just support it in that case?
Well, I'm not going to prejudge. We have to pass a Real ID bill, or Minnesotans are going to be able to get on commercial airplanes starting in January. I mean, it's just no other option. It's not about satisfying ourselves. It's first and foremost about satisfying the federal government. And we had one meeting with the national governors, so we met with the new Secretary of Homeland Security, and Governor of Montana actually raised, because they have considerable opposition, I guess, to and he said, well, are you willing to be flexible on the effective date next January? And the Secretary said, well, if states are in the process of complying according to our measures, then, you know, he said, I think we can give a little elbow room. But if states are not making that effort, then we won't. So again, I think the writing is very clearly on the wall. We have to pass something that meets the criteria the federal government set forth. And you know, up until a year ago, we couldn't even have that conversation. DPS was not allowed to even talk about it, the federal government. Since that ban has been lifted, they've had numerous conversations, and I think we have a clear understanding of what's going to be required. And I think we can demonstrate to the federal authorities that even if we don't have it totally completed, the licenses aren't all distributed. I don't know if they will be or not, but going through the process and expedited rulemaking is part of what we've asked for in the legislation. But I'm very confident if we pass what is on the plate as it relates to the Real ID itself, that we'll be able to assure Minnesotans that they're going to not be encumbered.
Given that urgency, Governor, then if ultimately we were to have a bill on your desk that does have the codification of the prohibition in there, would you be inclined to sign it?
I'm not gonna, I'd prefer they work it out and send me a clean bill.
Do you recall if you voted for the Real ID Act? Do you recall if you voted for the Real ID Act in 2005? Or in the Senate then?
Do I recall? I don't recall.
Do you think you should have or
I
shouldn't
don't,
have?
well, I don't know, I don't. God, I don't remember what I did last week. I'd have to look and see what the bill said, what it did and didn't do. Well, I'll look it up,
Governor,
Said, unlike the president, I don't have a continuum of tweets that go back, decades, so, but we'll get it out of the Senate archives.
Governor, there's a bill in the House similar to one you vetoed in 2011 that would have banned reimbursements for abortion services for low-income women on medical assistance. It's expected to come to the House floor for a vote after the break. Would you, and there's also a companion bill in the Senate, how would you act on it if it reached your desk?
Same way I did before, veto it. And those, again, are the kind of provisions that the conference committees can choose to put in the bills with the certainty that I'm going to veto them or not. And so when they say, well, it's up to me, no, it's really up to them. Again, these letters that we'll be sending next week will make it very clear what's in each of the conference reports, the House and Senate versions, is matters that I can't and won't agree to. So, again, the choice is theirs. They can either, if they want to work with us during that process and work these things out then, great. If not, then they'll have to proceed how they're going to proceed.
Governor, yesterday the House passed its Jobs and Environment bill that contained an amendment in there that would essentially allow Enbridge to build the pipeline for Route Number 3 to replace that pipeline. What's your thoughts on that? Is that veto material for you?
Yeah, that's absolutely unacceptable. The PUC's operated for over 40 years, independently of political parties, independent of governors and legislatures, and it was set up intentionally to do that because there's so much at stake in these decisions financially and in terms of the impact on people's lives, and there's a process set up that the PUC is following. And for a couple of legislators to want to hijack that and think that they, whatever their political motives, can make a better decision on something of that magnitude is just crazy and wrong. And I will not allow anything like that to happen.
Governor, the House will be voting on their Health and Human Services bill today. I wanted to get your thoughts on that bill as it stands right now.
Well, they're very, very serious cuts. And again, this is where some of the alternative math applies. I mean, to assume there's not going to be any inflationary increase in Medicaid when, Medicaid services are largely dictated by federal statute. I mean, we have our own too. I mean, it's just conjure up savings that are just not possible and not real. It becomes, as well as the cuts themselves. So, that's going to be a major area of difference with the policy, kind of policy things that we just discussed, as well as the dollars. But these are dollars that go to services for people. Medicaid, much maligned by Republicans in Washington and some here, goes, as one report evidenced very, very well just a week or so ago, goes in over 60%, so about 2/3 goes to the elderly and people with disabilities. And then you add in families with young children. I mean, that's the vast majority of it all. So which seniors are we not going to put in nursing homes? Which people with disabilities are we not going to provide personal care attendants and other services so they can remain independent and less costly than if they were in nursing facilities? I mean, that's the kind of, when people, when they're first and foremost and sometimes only concern is what the number is, without looking at the consequences of that number on real people's lives. We're not talking about agency bureaucracies here. We're talking about money or services that go out to people who desperately need it. There's no way you can cut, what is it, 210 million? What is the inflation for Medicaid? I mean, I take it away and have nobody be affected by that? I mean, it's nonsensical. So that bill will definitely be one we'll have to spend a considerable amount of time on.
Governor, the state government finance bill that the House passed includes a provision, a lights-on provision, that would fund government at 95% if there, in an odd number year, the state fails to get its budget straightened out. How do you view that? Is that a recipe for sort of enacting a automatic 5% across the board budget cut in a case where the budget isn't finalized in time? And is that a troublesome provision in that bill for you?
Well, I share a strong desire to avoid a shutdown, but your point's well taken. I mean, there's where the law of unintended consequences really, rears its ugly head. If you reduce the incentive or the imperative to reach a compromise on budget bills, what are you going to end up with? The alternative is, having deadlines, absolute deadlines with negative consequences for failing to meet them, are one of the ways in which you get resolution on matters of policy and budget among people who are very different views, sincerely held. One of the reasons that in Congress, where they have a 2-year cycle, nothing really gets accomplished until after the election, when they know they got 2 weeks before the next Congress. I mean, then they got, for the first time in 2 years, a real deadline. Similarly, here, used to be ending the session at the constitutionally required date was enough of failing to do so was enough of a negative consequence that people were really motivated by that. I think that's still a factor, but seems to be less compelling if you look at the last decade. The shutdown was draconian in its effects on services to people and like, and there's still quite a few legislators who weren't present in 2011. I remember it vividly. But if we had not had compelling need to come back, we couldn't agree on June 30th. 3 weeks later, we had to have some very serious consequences to compel us to come back and make an agreement that nobody wanted to make. So I'd have to think about it. It's a long-winded way of saying. But absolute deadlines with real-world consequences for failing to meet those deadlines, I think, is essential in this process.
Governor, Senator Gazelka told me he thinks the biggest potential sticking point in budget negotiations will be over pre-kindergarten. What kind of a fight do you expect you'll have on your hands here?
What ought to drive the discussion is what's best for 4-year-olds, and not what the biases are of various adults. I mean, Speaker Dowd said it a couple of times last year. The reason we're against pre-K is because that means more public school teachers. Teachers contribute money to the teachers' union. Teachers' union gives money to Democrats. So we're not going to reward that. Well, where are the 4-year-olds in that equation? My bill provides for additional funding for quality child care, for home visits, as well as for pre-K, because I don't think it's one approach is right for everywhere and everybody. But there are areas of the state where there is not quality child care, according to the Parent Aware ratings, available. So the only alternative for parents who want to give their 4-year-olds a chance, a better chance in life, is through a pre-K program. And you talk to people who are running those programs all over the state, and they think they're making a huge difference. You talk to kindergarten teachers who talk about the difference of kids who come in with that experience and those who haven't. Makes a very major difference. I mean, the evidence is clear that these programs help 4-year-olds, and then that carries through. Thank goodness we now have all-day kindergarten, which we didn't have when I started. So we're reaching the point where we recognize the imperative to talk about closing the achievement gap. The best way is to prevent it from starting, and these are essential elements in that. And to say they're not going to do it because of the politics is just really irresponsible. So I will hold out very hard for for additional funding for pre-K. Because you have, I forget the exact number, but 269 school districts that have applied for the next round of funding. I mean, that's your evidence right there. They're the ones that have the expertise to know what works and what doesn't, and it's problematic for many of them with the facilities and other changes, but they're willing to go through that because they know this makes a real difference. And that should be our job here, making a real difference, positive differences in the lives of 4-year-olds and everybody else.
And the HHS bill repeals the MNsure exchange. Your thoughts on that?
MNsure is functioning very well these days. I don't know of anybody who's got serious issues with MNsure. It's a great favorite whipping boy of legislators, and because of its beginning. But the federal exchange has its own challenges, and you're one of 34 states now in the federal exchange. You think you're going to get better attention through that kind of much larger operation than you would from MNsure? I just and the transition costs, which really have not been sufficiently documented. I mean, so what's the gain? I don't see one.
One question. With the public safety, there was the comment that the minority leader made. I'm wondering what your reaction is that her colleagues on the Republican side are demanding an apology. Greg Davids actually called for a resignation, although he walked that back. What's your reaction to that? Do you think that she should apologize?
No. I watched the transparent on the floor. I watched the video of it. I thought she was very passionate, but in a very sincere way. I don't know what was going on in the back room. I don't know what goes on in those back rooms. I can't comment on what the facts of that situation were, but I mean, I think if minority legislators are not receiving the same respect and consideration that others are, then I think that needs to be called out. Should be.
Republican leaders in the House and the Senate going into negotiations. How would you characterize it?
Well, I lunch with Speaker Doubt last week, and we had a very cordial lunch, and he hasn't said anything good about me since, so I'm not sure. I met with, had lunch with Representative Pepin earlier this week. It was very cordial and very helpful to understand some of the dynamics that they're dealing with in their caucus. I had lunch yesterday with Senator Gazelka. I think he and I have established a very good relationship, and he very sincerely wants to get these matters resolved in the least contentious way possible and get them done up front, and told it more power to him. He'll play a pivotal role in that scenario, however it unfolds. So we've had 5, I believe, different bipartisan meetings with legislators in various environment, health, and human services alike. Again, to be engaged with them. Had breakfast with the leaders, both the House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans separately at their request. I mean, and again, our commissioners have been fully engaged. Really great policy staff's been fully engaged. Any legislator who wanted to meet with me, I've been immediately responsive to. So helps enormously to be in this building back here with proximity. So I mean, it's not going to be for lack of attention and effort on my part and my administration's part, and they deserve that. I mean, they got elected and they have majorities, and it's really it's a two-way street. I have my responsibility to make these relationships work as well as they do.
You said you're convinced that wants a tidy conclusion to this. Are you convinced similarly with Speaker Doubt?
I think the proof is in the pudding. My mother had all these old things. I don't know if anybody ever remembers, actions speak louder than words. That was when she used to. I also knew I was in trouble when she said actions speak louder than words. We'll see in the next 5 weeks. And again, I'm not just saying the Senate doesn't have its culpability, and they obviously think I have my culpability. So, we'll see. After going through 2011 and going through 2015, I'm well aware of how difficult it is to reconcile a budget, and especially when you throw in the policy measures. One of the ways we got the shutdown concluded in 2011 was one of the concessions that the Republican leaders made was to take all the policy out of the budget bills. So then we were dealing with the numbers, which is enough of a difference. We had a $3 billion gap. Told we have about a $1 billion gap this time. This time we had a $6 billion projected deficit. Now we got a $1.5 billion surplus. So we've got what should be on the face of it a more resolvable set of issues if we can clean all the policy out of it, which again I don't see them as yet prepared to do, but we'll have to see how it unfolds.
One more question?
Yeah.
With regard to public safety, both the houses have passed a bill. It'll be moving on to conference at some point. Publicly, the Supreme Court Justice this week was asked, what keeps her up at night? Is it any court cases, anything like that? She said, none of that. It's the budget that we face. Do you think she has reason for concern?
I think
given what
she
you've
does,
seen?
and I supported her full budget request. I mean, the court system is overloaded. You know, judges are overloaded. Public defenders are overloaded, the whole system. And I absolutely support every dollar of her request, and I will fight very hard to uphold that in both the House and the Senate. It's really essential. I mean, they're an independent branch of our government, but they're crucial, and as I said, their needs are acute. She's a very fiscally responsible, conservative person. She had nothing in. I've dealt with her now in all the different every year. Everything is very carefully considered and very well justified. I don't know why legislative committees weren't responsive to that. I think the legislative branch and the executive branch have a responsibility to provide the judicial branch with the wherewithal, within good reason, to accomplish what they define as necessary. I'm not an expert. Nobody in the legislature is an expert. We have our opinions on the scope of the judicial responsibilities and their resources available to meet them. But I mean, who else are we going to? Whose judgment are we going to substitute over the Chief Justice? I mean, just one of these things that doesn't make, to me, it doesn't make any sense. So I will fight hard for that budget. Thank you.